What we're going to be focusing on is carrying on from where Gary left off. We'll be talking about body chemistry. Now, the aspect of body chemistry I want to talk to you about this evening is the pH factor, or the pH system of the body. Now, most of us have heard about pH. Oftentimes people that have gardens, they have a look at the pH of the soil. People that are interested in skincare and cosmetics will often have a look at their skin creams. They have a special pH factors in all the skin cream products. People that have pools or maybe aquariums will often know of pH when they need to actually keep the correct acid-alkaline balance in their pools or the fish tanks to make sure that the environment's right. But we don't often hear about the pH in relation to its internal or how it affects our bodies on an internal basis. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, focusing on how the pH actually affects our health. Then we're going to go into what factors we can actually do to remedy that situation. I first want to introduce you to what we call the disease model. Now, this is certainly something I'd like you to remember. I'm actually going to go into the different stages in a little bit more in depth as we go along. So don't worry about these in trying to sort of take notes just particularly at the moment. The most important thing I want you to note at this stage is having a look at the disease process. The first thing in the development of disease is the violations of the laws of health. Last night, Gary had the opportunity to talk to you about the laws of health in relation to particularly having a look at its effects on cancer, but in general health also. All disease has some sort of root or foundation with a violation of the laws of health. And you'll notice then that from violations of laws of health, we then have a rapid progression downwards of disease. It leads on to acid stress, free calcium, chronic inflammation, anaerobic metabolism, oxidative stress in the body, and ultimately connective tissue degeneration and breakdown. And we're going to focus and go into those in a little bit more depth in a moment. But one thing I want you to remember now is that all violations of the laws of health tend to produce acidity. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. Does anyone remember some of the laws of health? Name one. Okay, pure air. I heard pure air. Well, first of all, we'll talk about pure air. When we actually measure pH, we look at the level of hydrogen ions in a solution, and I'm going to go into that, so don't get too lost in that at the moment in the actual chemistry side of things. We also look at the levels of oxygen that's in a solution as well. So the more acid a solution, generally the less oxygen, and the more alkaline a solution, generally the more oxygen. When we breathe incorrectly, when we tend to shallow breathe, when we breathe poorly at night time, oftentimes a lot of people actually tend to mouth breathe. We get a poor oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. We tend to actually, our levels of oxygen tend to reduce. When they reduce in our system, because we have less oxygen, we become acid. It's quite simple, really. Another example is water. Water's another one of the laws of health, making sure that we have plenty of water on a daily basis. Water helps to flush our system. It constantly actually flushes the kidneys and actually gets rid of acids via the kidneys. In fact, a healthy person without disease is still going to constantly be producing acids. Acids are the ultimate breakdown in most chemical reactions in our bodies. So generally speaking, if we didn't do anything, our body, even if we were healthy, is still going to become acid. And that's important to remember. We don't become alkaline without doing things to really help to produce alkaline substances in the system. So that's the first thing I want you to remember here. So by drinking water, what we do is we're actually flushing the kidneys, flushing the acids from the system, and therefore reducing acids, we become more alkaline. But if we don't drink the water, the acids build up in our blood, we become acid. It's quite simple, really. If we had time tonight, I'd be able to go through each of the laws of health and quite simply explain to you how by violating those laws of health, we tend to produce an acid environment in the system. Now, the pH scale. The pH scale is a scale from 0 to 14. In the middle is 7. It's right in the middle. 7 is considered what we consider as neutral. So something with a pH measurement of 7 is considered a neutral substance. It's neither alkaline or acid. It's right in the middle. Anything below 7 is acid, and anything above 7 is an alkaline substance. And once again, just to go over it, we're measuring the level of hydrogen ions in a solution, and we're also looking at the level of oxygen in a solution as well. Now we're going to take water as an example here. You'll notice up on the chart we can actually have a look. If you have a good look at that chart, we look at the first part of the slide there. Well, notice that distilled water has a pH of 7.0. Distilled water has no minerals and environmental chemicals or toxins because they've been evaporated out. It's pure water. Now the chemical composition of water is what? H2O. Okay, H2O when it's distilled water, when it has a pH of exactly 7.0. That means that if we have a look at water under a microscope, you'll notice I've got some large circles with tiny little yellow circles attached. The large circles are the oxygen molecules. The two tiny yellow circles attached to that oxygen molecule are hydrogen ions. And that makes, there's 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen. That makes water. And you'll notice that in that first slide there, we have for every 1 oxygen, there's 2 hydrogen. Even though that's not attached, in that solution, there's still 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen. That makes that solution exactly 7.0. The next slide, we have a look. You'll notice that there's not as much oxygen, but there's plenty of hydrogen. So that solution is an acid solution. There's lots more hydrogen and very low levels of oxygen. And then we have the reverse. You'll notice at the bottom slide, we have lots of oxygen and a lot less hydrogen. So that's actually an alkaline solution. In the body, we have some very specific pH parameters. First of all, I want to have a look at the blood, and we'll focus on that in a moment, and then we'll have a look at how we can actually gauge the pH parameters and have a look at its impact on health. Now, the arteries, the arterial blood has a reference range, if you like, from 7.35 to 7.45. It can actually vary between 7.35 and 7.45 on the scale, which means it's actually just slightly on the alkaline side of the scale. And it's just above 7.4. Venous blood, so that's the blood in our veins, on the other hand, has a pH of around about 7.30 to 7.40. So it's a little bit, even though it's still alkaline, it's tending towards the acid side a little bit more. Now the reason for that is that in our venous blood or in our veins, our blood has already carried the oxygen to the cells, it's carried nutrients to the cells, and it's carrying wastes back from the cells, which are going to be recycled through the liver, recycled through the lungs, and ultimately taken back with more oxygen through the system again. So it has approximately 55 to 65% less oxygen in the veins than in the arteries because we've already transported that oxygen to the cells, which means obviously we're going to be a little bit more acid. Between 7.4, if we actually have a look at the drop, we only have to drop between 7.4 down to 7.35, and already, as I said, there's a 55 to 65% drop in oxygen content. That's very, very important to remember. So although it doesn't look much on the scale, it's only 0.05, it's a huge drop when it comes to looking at the oxygen levels in our body. Very, very important to remember. Now the pH parameter, you'll notice that if we have a look down at urine and saliva, they have a much larger reference range. So they can go between 4.5 up to around about 8, depending on what it is, urine or saliva. The blood has a very narrow margin of error. It has to stay within that specific range. And if we start to drop down, then certain things, disease can result from that process. This process is so important, in fact, that the body will do whatever it takes to override every other function, and I mean every other function, to keep the blood at a pH of 7.4. Now, if you're sitting here today and your face is not blue, and I'm hoping that no one's got a blue face here at the moment, I can guarantee that you all have a blood pH of approximately, or very, very close to 7.4. Okay? Making sure, because the body will override every other function to keep it at that pH. But it's at the expense of other areas of the body. And we're going to go into that in a moment. With the pH of the blood, if we drop down to 7.2, we'll fall into a coma and we'll die. We only have to drop down 0.2. From 7.4 to 7.2, we'll fall into a coma and we'll die. It's that serious. Now, the urine and the saliva, on the other hand, have a much larger degree of variation. The urine tends to go down to about 4.5. That's because it's a very important organ for elimination of acids, and it can go right up to about 7.5. And the saliva is very similar. It's around about 5.5 to 8, so it does vary quite considerably also. Generally speaking, though, the urine and the saliva should have a pH of around about 7.0 in good health. Now, if we were to measure it, what we want to do is we want to measure it 2 hours after a meal to get the most accurate results. The reason for that, we take a classic example. We'll have a look at the urine, for instance. First thing in the morning, when we get up, what do you think the pH of the urine is going to be? It's going to be a bit acid, isn't it? The reason for that, we haven't generally been drinking a lot of fluid throughout the night. We haven't been remaining active. So we're going to be getting rid of more acids in the morning. So first thing, it's going to be a little acid. The saliva, we'll take a look at that before a meal. It's actually very important. The saliva does vary over the day. And you'll find that before meal times, the saliva tends to actually become a little bit more acid. And this is important to focus on for a moment. When we're digesting, or when we're actually eating our meals, it's very, very important that we make sure that we chew our foods adequately. Digestion begins in the mouth. When we don't chew our food adequately, we don't mix the saliva in, we don't get the correct pH to start the digestive process, and everything from there on starts to fall out of balance. It begins in the mouth. Not only is the pH of the saliva important, but there's also certain enzymes that are important for the breakdown of carbohydrates and proteins and different things also. So digestion begins in the mouth. It's very important to remember that process. Okay, now a great way to actually have a look at how our health is by measuring our urine and our saliva 2 hours after a meal. If we measure our urine and saliva 2 hours after a meal, it gives us an indication of what our cell pH is like. Now, our cell pH, I haven't got actually up there on the pH parameters, but you'll find the cell pH is approximately similar to the saliva. It's around about the 5.5 to 8. It does vary quite significantly also. But a healthy cell is around about the neutral pH also. You'll find it's around about the 7.0 or thereabouts. If our urine and saliva are constantly out, if we're always tending towards the acid, we know that our cell pH is also going to be tending towards the acid. Now, an interesting study was done where they actually took a couple of hundred American citizens. Why? We wonder why all the research is always done on Americans. But so they took a couple of hundred Americans and they tested the cell pH. And you actually have to take a biopsy and go right in to test the cell pH. It's not a simple test that you can do. But they found that the average American has a cell pH of approximately 5.5. Now, the healthy cell is around about 7.0. And remember, we're looking at the oxygen levels in the cell. So we need adequate oxygen for a good healthy cell, right? The average American has a cell pH of 5.5. In order to actually get cancer, we need a cell pH of around 5.5. Now, it's not any wonder why these days that we see 1 in 3, and even, I believe, recently they're looking at almost 2 out of every 3 people these days are getting some form of cancer, whether it's skin cancer or some sort of internal form of cancer. It's not any wonder these days when we have a look at things like this. Okay, now there was an interesting laboratory study done. The body has approximately 45 litres of fluid. If we look at the cells, if we look at our blood, if we look at everything in total, there's around about 45. That may vary depending on the person's size, if we have a look at the adipose or the fat tissue in a person, but approximately 45 litres of fluid. In this laboratory study, they actually took a barrel, a sterile barrel, and it had a pH, or they filled it up with water that had a pH, or fluid that had a pH of 7.4, which is the same as the pH of our bloodstream. They then took a 250 ml glass, so 250 ml, very small, just an average size glass of an acid substance. They added that acid substance that had a pH of 2.6 to the 45 litres of fluid, and it changed the pH quite significantly. Now, can anyone guess what they would have used, the acid substance that they added to the 45 litres of fluid? It was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has a pH of 2.6. That caused the whole barrel to drop down to 4.6 pH. Now remember, coming back to the pH parameters, what do we have to drop down to and we die? 7.2. The barrel dropped to 4.6. What's going on? Why don't we die when we have a glass of Coca-Cola? We take coffee. Coffee has a pH of around about 3.0. Why don't we die when we drink a glass of coffee? Alcohol. Alcohol has a pH very similar to coffee. It can be a little bit more acid, can be slightly more towards the alkaline, but it's still very, very acid. And the net result after the breakdown of alcohol goes through our liver is extremely acid producing. Why don't we die after drinking alcohol? Smoking. One of the most acid forming things we can do to our body. We're depleting the oxygen content coming into our lungs. Oxygen, remember once again, if we have increased oxygen, we have increased alkalinity in the system. Decreased oxygen, more acid. One of the most acid forming things. Why don't we die when we smoke one cigarette? What effects does that have on our system? The body truly is designed to survive. It is an amazing organism. And our body has compensatory mechanisms. Now, for minor changes in our pH, constantly keeping our body at a correct balance, and particularly looking at our bloodstream, keeping that blood at 7.4, we have what we call buffers in our bloodstream. They're minerals. Some of them tend to be a little bit acid, some of them tend to be a little bit alkaline, and they actually compensate for minor changes. So if our blood pH was to change from 7.4 down to 7.3991, then the buffers will come in and they'll pick it back up to 7.4 again. But for major changes that happen very, very quickly, the body has no control, or the regulating mechanisms that are in place have no control over these major changes. So the body goes into alarm mode. The pH of the blood will start dropping down to 7.39, 7.38, 7.37, until it gets down to 7.35. Now the pH of the blood at 7.35, remembering that it has around about 65% less oxygen, is what we call critical pH. When we get to that stage, alarm bells go off and the body says, if we don't do something about it, right now we're going to be in serious trouble. So the body then robs some very alkaline substances from other parts of the body to actually bring the pH of the blood back up again. Where do you think the most alkaline substances in our body are? Here. In the bones. Our most alkaline substances are actually contained in the bones. It's a phosphate molecule called PO4. What happens is when we go under this acid stress, when we start to get down to 7.35, the body says, I need to actually correct this situation. I need to actually bring the blood back up to 7.4 or else we're in serious trouble very, very soon. So it actually starts to leach phosphates from the bones. These substances are extremely alkaline and they bring the bloodstream back up to 7.4 very, very quickly. But guess what's attached to phosphates in the bones? Calcium. Calcium's bound to phosphates, and in that form, it's a very safe form. In fact, that's the form that our body needs in our bones. But when it comes out into the bloodstream, the blood, or the body, actually uses the phosphates to alkalize the blood and bring it back up to 7.4. The body doesn't need the calcium. It just comes along for the ride because the phosphates are coming out. The unfortunate thing is that the body doesn't use the calcium to bring that pH back up. It just starts floating around in the bloodstream. That calcium is now in a free, unbound form, which means it's actually a highly dangerous substance. When it's bound with phosphates or some other mineral, for instance, it's in a safe form. But when it's actually unbound, it's no longer attached to something, it's extremely dangerous. And we get what we call free calcium excess. It's an excess of calcium, but it's not just calcium, it's free calcium, it's unbound calcium, which comes out because of the acid stress. Calcification is one of the first things that starts to occur when we begin to become acid, because there's free calcium excess. So we get calcification of many parts of the body. Oftentimes we tend to feel it first in our joints. We get little niggle aches and pains and creaks in our joints, tend to not function so well. Other things that can occur is our body really starts to try and filter out this calcium. The kidneys are one of the main filtration systems of the body. Therefore, the calcium actually starts to build up in the kidneys. And we start to get one of the most common forms of kidney stones, which is a calcium oxalate stone. And it builds up in there and we start to get real issues, particularly certain people which have a weakness in that particular area may find that they'll get a calcification building up in the kidneys and kidney stones. It may not manifest there though. For someone else, it may manifest in another area. It might be the liver. Now the liver is another filtration system of our bodies. It's responsible for filtering the blood. So as the calcium goes through, it actually might start to get clogged up in the liver. Now, Gary talked about cholesterol. And oftentimes, as Gary was talking about before, we often tend to think of cholesterol as a really nasty thing. Believe it or not, the body produces over 50% of our cholesterol naturally anyway. So as Gary was saying before, if we actually have high cholesterol, we've got to look at maybe why our cholesterol is high in the first place. It can be up to 90% of our cholesterol produced naturally by our body anyway. But calcium has an incredible affinity for cholesterol. And this is where the problem lies with cholesterol. Our body has mechanisms in place. In fact, the liver and our bile, which is produced from the liver, is the way that our body will get rid of cholesterol. And that will go into our small intestine and ultimately will pass that out. But if cholesterol is actually bound with some sort of mineral like calcium, for instance, that actually starts to solidify the cholesterol. When the cholesterol starts to become solid, it's no longer in a form the body can eliminate effectively. It's now bound up and starts to become a waxy, cloggy substance. That can build up in several areas of the body. One of those main areas is in the liver, because the body's trying to get rid of it, and in particular in the gallbladder. The gallbladder is our storehouse for bile, and the bile is what our body uses to break down fats that we eat. So we eliminate cholesterol in that bile also. We start getting these waxy deposits building up in the gallbladder, and we end up with gallstones. Another area it might build up in is the arteries. Once again, cholesterol might be floating around the bloodstream. We start to get calcium binding with the cholesterol in our arteries, and we start to get things like atherosclerotic plaques. It's not any wonder why we see so much cardiovascular disease these days. The pineal gland is an interesting one. Gary was talking about before about its effects in producing melatonin. He talked about the effects that it has on our sleep cycles, and that's very important. But also in its effects in terms of an antioxidant and protecting our body from things like cancer as we get older. Studies have shown that, particularly when they actually have a look at in biopsies and different things, that the pineal gland, as we begin to age, starts to calcify over. It's as we age, it just generally tends to happen in a lot of people, and it's not any wonder why we see people as we get older starting to have difficulties with sleep. This is one of the factors. The calcium is actually binding or actually calcifying that gland. It's no longer able to work as an effective gland, produce the hormones effectively. So we actually produce suboptimal levels of melatonin. Remember also that melatonin is important in protecting us against cancer. And if we're calcifying that pineal gland, we're not producing the melatonin, then we're more susceptible to cancer also. Chronic inflammation. Now, as this calcium continues to travel around the system, it starts to create an inflammatory process. The body says, I've got to try and get rid of this calcium, and it starts to become irritated. The immune system starts to try and fight it, and we start getting this inflammatory process going on. Now, chronic means something that didn't happen overnight. It's a progressive thing, okay? So it's not something that will just crop up all of a sudden, although oftentimes we tend to actually get chronic conditions without even knowing that they're occurring, and then one day we'll think, oh, my joints are a little bit stiff. It's been going on for a long period of time, but we've never really noticed it, and ultimately we end up noticing it, but it's been developing over that period of time. Arthritis. Inflammation, when we look at disease, and we look at specific diseases, any of our itis diseases are our inflammatory diseases. So itis means inflammation of. If we have a look, some simple medical terminology here, if we have a look at arthritis, that basically means inflammation of the joint. Colitis is inflammation of the colon and the digestive system. Nephritis, inflammation of the kidneys. Pancreatitis, inflammation of the pancreas. All these chronic inflammatory conditions can certainly be affected by a chronic inflammatory process going on. Now, I'm not saying this is the only cause of all these diseases, and there's other contributing factors that we have to look at. And this is important to remember, that we all are individuals, and there's so many multifactorial things going on. But this is one of the main core issues, and you really don't want to actually overlook this when you're looking at these disease states. An anaerobic metabolism. Now, that's quite a reasonably big word for something very simple. Basically, it means low levels of oxygen. It means that our body gets used to low levels of oxygen. Remember, when we're acid, we have less oxygen. So our body gets used to that. But in that process of our body getting used to that, we start producing energy under a low oxygen environment. Oxygen's vital for energy production. But we end up producing energy with low levels of oxygen anyway, because once again, the body's designed to survive. We have mechanisms in place. But the unfortunate thing is, in that process, we start to develop byproducts. Now, guess what these byproducts are that are produced when we produce oxygen in low oxygen environment? They're acids. We produce more acids, which contributes to the system once again. So we become more and more acid. Now, low oxygen is a perfect breeding ground for microbes and bacteria and organisms. Also, a low pH, because we have low oxygen, we also have a low pH, we tend to become more acid, is also a wonderful breeding ground for microbes and bacteria and organisms. Now, when we die, what happens is we have no oxygen, obviously. We're not breathing anymore, so we start to become more and more acid. Over a period of time, what happens is it creates a perfect environment for bacteria and organisms and all kinds of different microbes to come in and actually start breaking down the body, and we start ultimately going back to the soil. That's ultimately what happens when we die. But these microbes and bacteria and organisms, they don't differentiate between if we're alive or if we're dead. They only go by the environment that's actually created in our system. Now, if we're creating this extremely low level of oxygen environment, it's a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and microbes and organisms to actually start breaking down our cells. Even while we're still living, we're actually becoming sicker and sicker and sicker because of the microbes and the organisms, and this perfect environment for those to breed in. Not only do we actually create this environment, we also, the byproduct or the breakdown of these bacteria and the microbes and the organisms, they produce byproducts. Now, guess what these byproducts are? They're acid. We produce more toxic material, which is more acid. So it actually contributes to the cycle once again. Can you see how this is going? It's a vicious cycle where we're becoming more and more acid. So you'll notice that as we go down through these stages, it actually becomes progressive. It starts out very subtle, but once we get down to the final stages, because everything is producing more and more acid, it's compounding and becoming more and more and more serious. Oxygen is also essential for good healthy cells. If we don't have oxygen in place, we don't have good healing. So we get very poor healing going on. And this, like cuts and bruises and all kinds of things, take a lot longer to heal over a period of time, just because of low levels of oxygen. Now, all these acids and these toxins which are produced start to create what we call oxidative stress. Has anyone heard of free radical damage? Okay, now I'm a guy, so I'm going to use a guy example. Free radical damage to a cell is like if we were to take a car, we were to leave it out in the environment, we were to get the air, the salt water, and the metal would start to break down. What would start to occur? Start to rust. Free radical damage to a cell is like rust to a metal. It's exactly the same principle. This is what happens to our cells. So after a period of time, these free radicals or these oxidants, what they do is actually start to bounce off other cells. They come in contact with many cells and they damage the cell membrane of good healthy cells. So they start to break down a good healthy cell, and ultimately that ends up creating more acid because of the breakdown of that cell, and it contributes to this process once again. We become more acid. Many of you may have heard of free radicals and, more importantly, of antioxidants because of their effect on premature aging. These days we tend to, like you have a look in the creams and the facial creams, and they have all these lovely antioxidants and things which are meant to help to slow down that aging process. Now, it's a good theory, and certainly I'm sure there's some merit to it, but the most important thing is making sure that our internal balance is correct, because what we are internally is going to reflect on what comes out externally also. So it's nice to put them on here, but really, are we putting antioxidants back in our body and protecting the ultimate regeneration of good healthy cells in the first place? Ultimately, we get down to the final stage, and this is known as connective tissue degeneration. One of the first places that this becomes evident is in the mouth, and we start getting periodontal diseases and gum diseases occurring. And this is a great place to start, is to go to what we call a biodentist or a holistic dentist, someone who's aware of this process. And if you do want to find out more information about those, then certainly you can come and see Gary and myself later on, and we can have a chat to you about that. But go to a biodentist and they can give you a good assessment of your mouth and work out if this connective tissue degeneration is already beginning to occur. Now, with natural medicine, one of the most important things is prevention. If we can detect something early enough, then we can actually get in before more serious disease occurs. So it's really great to heed the early warning signs, to actually go get an assessment from a good biodentist and see if some of these things are going on. Now, you may not need that. You may be aware that already a lot of the things I've talked to you about this evening, you might already be able to relate to a lot of those anyway. You might have that going on, so you can see that process. But some of you may not. Some of you, it may be more subtle. So certainly doing something like that would be very beneficial. Connective tissue is our matrix. It's what holds everything together. It holds our organs in place. In fact, it not only holds our organs in place, but it actually forms part of the main framework for our organs themselves. It holds tissues. It holds our bones in place. It holds everything together. When that starts to break down, we start getting things like herniation, or not only just hernias, but a weakness in that area which predisposes us to things like hernias. Now, oftentimes hernias may occur from heavy lifting or extreme stress on an area, so it may not necessarily be the direct cause, but if we've got a weakness there, then the connective tissue is not able to hold the digestive organs in place, and we may get a hernia occurring. Prolapsing. The large intestine and the small intestine, they all sit in a really important space in the abdominal cavity. What can occur when we get this connective tissue breakdown is these start to fall out of place. When they start to fall out of place, we start getting bends and twists in the colon and then the small intestine that shouldn't be there, and food, the transit time for food, actually slows down. So digestion is affected in a major way. When digestion is affected in a major way, we start to actually not get the nutrients we need. We start to actually ferment our foods more readily. In the fermentation process, guess what's produced? You've got it, acids. We start to continue on this process of breakdown and disease. Ultimately, at this stage, if you've related to any of the things that we've talked about so far, you may want to consider, well, what can I do about arthritis? What can I do about colitis? What can I do about connective tissue degeneration or periodontal disease? My answer is always going to be the same thing. Now, when we went to the disease model at the start of the lecture, I showed you that the process begins with violations of the laws of health. The most important thing, if you can relate to any of these disease processes, the most important thing that I want you to take away from this lecture today is that disease begins with violations of the laws of health. We truly were designed to survive. If we give our body the right environment, it's able to heal itself. It truly is an incredible organism, and I've seen some amazing things at Living Valley Springs just by providing the body with that right environment. We give it all the elements, the building blocks it needs, and it can create good, healthy cells. So the first thing you need to do is always go back to the foundations, those 8 laws of health. Then, after assessing those things, thinking, am I getting enough fresh air? Yeah, probably. Am I getting enough rest? Maybe not. Go through and actually list those things off. Once you've actually assessed things, then you can actually start to look at other factors. Well, what's my nutrient intake like? Do I need some nutritional support there? Do I need some herbs to actually help that process along also? All those types of things can actually contribute to the healing process, but they shouldn't be the first thing that we go to. Now, the unfortunate thing also is that we tend to see that natural health profession is starting to become very allopathic minded, basically like the general Western medicine way of thinking. We often tend to get people coming in. We have specific protocols from specific nutritional companies, and they say when a person comes in with this, then this is the supplement that's just for you. You come in with something else, when I've got a supplement for that too, these minerals are really good for that. Now they help, but we must come back to the foundational principles first, the violations of the laws of health. These are the environments, these are the things that contribute to the environment that our body was designed to best function under. So always remember that. Okay, now we've talked about the pH. So how can we actually assess our pH? We know that our blood pH is at 7.4, so that's not an issue. But we do want to have a look at our cell pH. What's going on there? Are our cells good, healthy, viable cells? So we start by having a look at recording our urine and saliva, because they're a great way of testing how our cells are going. If our urine and saliva have a pH of 7.0, 2 hours after a meal, I mentioned that earlier, I want to stress that again, 2 hours after a meal, after eating and completing your meal, your urine and saliva should have a pH of 7.0. If they don't, then we need to have a look at, well, what can we do to correct that pH process? Sometimes you might find that you actually tend to be a little bit alkaline. It's interesting, particularly the saliva will often tend to go a little bit alkaline. You sort of think, well, hey, I've got a pH of 7.5, I must be really healthy. But it's interesting that oftentimes the body will actually overcompensate. We'll end up producing large amounts of the phosphates that our body needs to make us more alkaline. It overcompensates and we get a very alkaline environment. But it's occurring because of acid stress. So don't just think that because your saliva initially might be really alkaline, that there's no problem there at all. You need to go back and have a look at all those laws of health and look if you're contributing to an acid stress environment. But this is a great indicator. Now what you want to, as I said before, if we were to have a look at our urine or saliva, particularly our urine at 6 a.m. in the morning, first getting up, say, if you get up then certainly that'd be great. You'll find that your pH will be a little bit acid. But say for instance we eat breakfast at 7, we finish by 8. 2 hours after 8 o'clock is obviously 10 o'clock. So 2 hours after breakfast, if we were to measure the pH, we want our urine and saliva to be 7.0. It doesn't matter what time you test it throughout the day. It might be 2 hours after lunch or even 2 hours after dinner. But 2 hours after the meal, we want the urine and the saliva at a pH of 7.0. Now, I don't want you all going away from here and testing your pH every single day for the rest of your life, because you can start to become a little bit paranoid about that. It's important to monitor your pH on a regular basis, but you'll find it will vary a little bit over the day, depending on what you've done. So, it's a nice indication sometimes on a daily basis, but I recommend that you test it, say, a couple of times a week, or maybe one time a week. Pick a day that you want to test your pH, or even once a fortnight, but once a week is a great way to do it. Pick a day and pick a time. Do it the same day and the same time on a weekly basis or fortnightly basis. Ultimately, if you start to balance out the pH, you might find if it's corrected and you've got a pH of 7.0 with your urine and saliva on a regular, ongoing basis, you may only want to test it once every couple of months just to make sure that you're continuing on the right process. But initially, you may need to test it a lot more often than that to get back onto the right track. So the urine and the saliva, what we want to do is we want to test it with some pH paper, and I'm going to show you that pH paper in a moment, how you actually test the urine and the saliva. It's quite a simple test, but that's the first thing. If we want to actually correct the pH, we have to know if our pH is a bit out of balance. We want to have a look, so we want to measure and record. After that, we want to have a look at the violations of the laws of health. We want to correct all those lifestyle violations. Without doing that first, we're just band-aiding. We might be using herbs. We might start to get improvement in some disease processes, but without going back to the foundations, we're only band-aiding the symptoms. We're not getting to the core issues. And this is very important. We need to come back to the lifestyle violations or the laws of health and correct those imbalances. Whoops. The next thing we want to have a look at is the friendly bacteria. Now, the friendly bacteria are the bacteria. We have friendly bacteria, by the way. We have unfriendly and friendly. The friendly bacteria are the bacteria which live in our small and our large intestine, things like Acidophilus and Bifidus and Lactobacillus. Some of those we may have heard of. They're just several. There's actually many different types. There's several of those ones. You may have heard of them in eating yogurt. You'll find those good bacteria that are contained in yogurt and kefir and a number of other similar cultured food products. Miso also contains a little bit, and tempeh has some good types of bacteria in them also. The friendly bacteria are absolutely essential. Now remember, we talked about if our environment in our body is acid, we create this perfect environment or breeding ground for microbes and organisms and bacteria to breed in. We don't want those nasty bacteria and microbes to get out of control, particularly in the digestive tract. This is the initial area we want to start addressing. The friendly bacteria actually help to contribute or keep those nasty forms of funguses and bacteria and microorganisms in check. If we have inadequate levels, then those nasty forms of bacteria thrive. Not only are they important to maintain that environment, they're actually essential for keeping the mucosal lining of the digestive tract in order. If they're out of balance, then we start to get a degeneration and a breakdown in the mucosal lining. We start to get poor absorption of nutrients, and we don't digest and break down and get our nutrients in the way that we should be. Now, if you'll notice further down, when we mineralise the body, when we actually put the correct mineral balance in, we actually help to alkalise the body. We cannot mineralise the body if we've got poor digestion. That's the way we're going to get minerals in, is via our digestive tract. We don't get minerals from breathing, and we don't really even get a lot of minerals from drinking fluids, although that goes through the digestive tract anyway. The way we get our minerals is via the digestive tract, and that's from having a good environment to really absorb those nutrients effectively. Absolutely essential. The next thing is lemons and limes. Now, many of you may ask, well, hang on a second, lemons and limes are actually acid. They are acid. They're actually acid in the digestive tract. They're what we call a weak acid. They're also an organic acid. They're found in nature, and they're attached to an enzyme also. But they're a weak acid. What weak acids do, particularly the weak acids found in fruits and vegetables, they actually cause the body to produce some very alkaline substances from the pancreas. And they stimulate an alkaline environment internally. So the net result is alkaline. Even though they're acid, because they're actually the weak acids found in nature attached to enzymes, they have this net result of producing extremely alkaline substances from the pancreas. Once again, we want to make sure that the pancreas is working adequately. And Gary, he talked about the pancreas as an integral or a very important part of the endocrine system. And we know that the building blocks for good, healthy hormones produced from the endocrine system are your minerals and your cholesterol. So making sure those things are in balance is very important also. So lemons and limes. We actually get all our clients that come through Living Valley Springs, or we suggest to them when they go home to start their day every morning, get up and actually have a good, say, 2 to 4 glasses of water first thing in the morning before you do anything else. 2 to 4 glasses of water. Number one, the water itself is going to help to flush out acids. Number two, we want to add a little bit of lemon or lime juice in there. That's going to help to actually increase the alkaline benefits in our body. Then we want to actually add a little pinch of good salt. Now Gary talked about salt earlier on, the Celtic salt. And that actually has, as we noticed next, when we mineralise the body, we actually really help to alkalise the body. So putting a pinch of that good Celtic salt in with the lemon drink in the morning is a great way to enhance the alkalising benefits of that drink first thing in the morning. The last points we've put in there, and I just want to talk just very briefly, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, the effects that emotions and the effects that all these other contributing factors like stress have on our lives. But I just want to focus just very quickly to give you an example. When we're stressed, when we're uptight, when we hold on to emotions, when we hold on to grudges, when we hold on to things, what happens is it causes our body to constrict. Without knowing, our muscles, our organs, everything starts to constrict up inside. This occurs during the stress or holding on to emotions and holding on to things internally. What that does is that actually closes over and causes the blood vessels to narrow. When the blood vessels narrow, we get less oxygen travelling through the body. When we have less oxygen travelling through the body, guess what environment it is? It's an acid environment. So being happy, forgiving others, not holding on to grudges is absolutely essential. And this is one of the most important aspects is focusing on this area. And we will be talking about this more later on in one of the other seminars. I think it's on Wednesday evening, I believe. So we'll focus on that. But certainly making sure that we're not holding on to those things. If you do all these other factors, if you have a look at the 8 laws of health, you get your fresh water, you get your exercise, you get your sunshine, you have your proper diet, you stay away from harmful things, you do all those factors, plenty of exercise, and you don't deal with the stress, you don't get your emotional, your mental side right, then you won't get right. You won't be able to actually correct the acid environment until we deal with those areas as well. So that's essential that we have adequate stress, ways of dealing with stress on a daily basis also. And the last thing is sharing the knowledge. If we share the knowledge with others, it actually reaffirms it in our own mind. We actually constantly learn more by doing that, and we're actually able to help to share others and they can benefit from the information also. So I really would encourage you to really share this information that you've learnt today with other people, and that way you'll be able to actually practice it yourself as well. Now, the last thing I want to mention to you before we finish up, I mentioned about measuring the pH. It's very, very simple to do. I've got here some pH paper. Can you go have a look at that, Keeper? Is that you got that? Good one. Okay. Now, there's many different types of pH paper you can buy on the market. This one here we actually get at Living Valley Springs. We import it from America, from New York. This particular paper is one of the best reference ranges of pH that I've seen for testing body fluids. So if you want to be able to actually test your pH, you need to get a pH paper with a good reference range. This one goes right down from 4.5 up to 7.5, which is the specific parameters we really need to test body fluids with. So we've done a lot of research and looking around, and this is the best one we've been able to find. So I highly recommend this particular one if you want to use the pH paper. Now what you do, I'll actually have to open this one up. Is it okay if I open it up? Okay. Okay, you'll notice that inside when you open it up, the pH paper is actually wrapped up. This will last you a fair while, so you don't need to worry about that. I think there's close to a metre or maybe even more in the pH paper. But you notice when I've opened it up, it's actually stored in metal, this paper out on the outside. That's actually to keep the environment from coming in contact with it. If we have an environment coming in contact with it, like air and moisture and all that kind of stuff, it can actually deteriorate the paper. The other thing you'll notice is as I'm getting out of the paper there, I'm putting it into the dispenser. I haven't touched it with my fingers. The reason for that is the perspiration on my fingers can actually have an effect on the pH, and it can deteriorate it, and it can actually contaminate the results of a test. Now, I'm going to take a small amount of it out. I've got it in there. Okay, so once it's in the dispenser, you just roll it out. Okey-dokey. I've torn a small piece of it off. Now this is ideal for testing your saliva. You don't need much more than that. So you'll notice that because it's a small amount, it will last for quite a while. If you're testing urine, on the other hand, I suggest you go for a little bit of a longer piece. That's a good way to do it. Okay, now, if you're testing urine, you actually need to test your midstream urine. Not the first, like straight away when it comes out, but test midstream urine. So start to urinate and actually pop it into the flow of the urine and then take it straight back out again. Give it a little quick shake, and then you'll find that after you've exposed it to a body fluid, it will actually start to change colour. Now you'll notice I haven't touched the end there, once again because my fingers have perspiration on them and they'll affect the results on the end of that. So I haven't touched that end that I've ripped off. That's the end that I'm testing with. Then I go along and actually measure it along the colour code system. It's very, very simple to do. So you actually have a look. If it was very yellow, you'd be quite sick. You have a pH of 4.5. It could be right up here to the 7.5. So you have a look and gauge by the colour code system. Now, oftentimes you'll find that the colours sort of mould one into another, and you might have a pH, say it's a little bit green but tending towards blue. You'll know that between green, which is 6.5, and blue, which is 7.0, it might be around 6.7, 6.8 on that scale. So that's the way. It's quite easy to follow that colour code system. You don't really want to actually test pH from a container that's maybe contaminated. For instance, if you were to get a cup, you've washed it with disinfectant and then you put urine in it to test your urine, who knows, maybe the detergent from the cup might be actually affecting your pH. So you're best off getting it straight in to your midstream urine flow. Saliva, very, very easy to test. You can actually get a good clean spoon and do that, but once again, it could be affected by detergents and things. So I suggest you actually just put saliva straight on to the pH paper there. Don't actually put it in your mouth. I don't really know what chemicals they use to actually make the colour change the way that it does. So it's probably not good to really chew on it as such, but just put a little bit of saliva onto the pH paper, and then you'll notice, I'll do it now for you, excuse me for a moment. And you'll notice that is beginning to change colour. Can everyone see that that's changing colour there? Very good look. It's right on the very end. It's a little bit small. But then we actually go along and we'll gauge the colour. And right on the end where I've got the most on there, it's starting to change blue there. It's a little bit green. Maybe I haven't drank quite enough water tonight. I should have some in a moment. But that's the way that you gauge the pH. It's quite easy to do. And as I said, I recommend that you go home and you keep on recording that on a regular basis for a period of time. Have a look at your violations of the laws of health or if you are violating any of those laws of health. Give your body the right environment, the right building blocks, all the essential things that it needs, and it truly is an amazing organism. It will heal itself. That's all we have time for this evening. Thank you very much.